Hello everyone, welcome back to Innovation Roots Studio. I'm your host Nupur, and today I'm really excited to have one special guest with us, Ron Westrom. Hi Ron, how are you?
Good. How are you?
I'm doing good too. So let me tell you about Ron. He is a professor of sociology emeritus at Eastern Michigan University. He specializes in the sociology of science and technology and in the dynamics of corporate culture. He has written three books and some 50 technical papers. Wonderful to have you, Ron, for this discussion.
My pleasure.
So, to begin with, Ron, please briefly share your experience on your journey of becoming a professor of sociology and being a theorist of cultural dynamics in organizations.
Sure. So I've always been interested in organizations, and so that was really the area I specialized in college and graduate school. Um, I'm very interested in the flow of information, and by the time I graduated with a PhD at the University of Chicago, I was very into how does information flow, and um, what happened is that essentially I started writing a notebook about how culture works. And in the beginning, it was very elementary and so forth. As time went on, I got more and more sophisticated. And essentially, I spent the rest of my adult life trying to look at issues associated with corporate and organizational culture. Uh, what really got me going was an aviation safety conference in Germany in 1986. And at that conference, I met some really incredible people. I met James Reason, who I think is probably the, the world's expert on accidents and so forth, and, uh, and so forth. So that really got me going, and I began to develop essentially the schema that now basically has become reasonably well recognized. Um, the difficulty with most studies on organizational culture is that they really don't have any metrics. Okay. So this is a very difficult thing because how do you compare one culture with another? It's sort of like each one of them is a special pearl and it's not really comparable to the other pearls. And that's not very satisfactory. So I began to look for what might be the matrix, the metrics that would distinguish these cultures. Well, in aviation safety, there was a very simple issue, and that issue was how well do organizations respond to problems? And so there was a really big meeting, sort of designed to be something like the be all and end all of aviation psychology and human factors meetings. And so I wrote this paper called Organizational and Interorganizational Thought. This is a paper that gets cited a lot, but since I never published it, I don't know how people actually have a chance to read it. Nonetheless, people do cite this. But it was in this paper that I developed the threefold types of organizational culture: pathological, bureaucratic, and generative. And I said, okay, so here's a metric which will help us figure out which organizations are likely to be successful at responding to their problems. Um, so that paper and the subsequent ones that followed um, got a lot of attention. Many people wanted to find out more about this. Does it really make sense? And the funny thing about it, of course, is that I was unable to publish the first paper. And the reason I couldn't publish that paper was because I wouldn't revise it according to what this journal editor or that journal editor wanted. And I admit this is probably a function of youth. I should have gone along, but I didn't. And nonetheless, people kept inviting me to meetings, and I kept going to meetings, and I kept developing this schema. And so, in the beginning, I thought each of these types, pathological, bureaucratic, and generative, they were sort of like ideal types. Max Weber used the phrase ideal type to describe this. But I discovered basically that the people who are reading this tend to see it as a continuum. And then I realized it is a continuum. And I eventually did a chart that basically makes it into a continuum. So the obvious issue is, okay, so it's a cute theory. Does it have any relevance to reality? Well, lots of people, the Australian Air Accident Bureau, for instance, worked it into their uh, process, and other people began to use these terms. And so the issue was, all right, you know, can we really prove that this works? Because I have lots of great examples, and I think, you know, all my colleagues have great examples too, but does it really work? So that I didn't find out that it really worked until about 2014, when the DevOps organization, an American organization that specializes in software research and development, uh, published a report, and they said, well, we've had a big sample, and I think the sample at that time was something like 14,000, and we found that the Westrom continuum actually predicts or helps predict research and development success. Well, that's great. You know, the thing about theorists is they don't have to have the empirical proof. I mean, to me, this is just obvious, okay? But it's always nice to see that if you have a big sample, it'll actually carry out your theory. And so that's how I found out that basically this theory works. And DevOps then did a great deal to publicize this. In fact, if you look it up on Google, you'll find DevOps culture, Westrom, blah, blah, blah. Okay. So that's basically the story of how I got there. Now, in the process, I did a lot of other stuff with information flow. I looked at things I call hidden events. I came up with a paper that I thought was really good, and I hope that other people would like it, called Requisite Imagination, the Fine Art of Anticipating What Might Go Wrong. And when I wrote this, I had a specific goal in mind. My goal was, I've got some examples of this, but I know other people out there have really good examples. And I hope they will write me and send me an angry letter and say, well, listen, you missed this and this and this and this. So far, that has not happened. People promise that they're going to say something, but they never do. But anyway, the basic point is that I'm really fascinated by processes and organizations that allow them to share information. I think that organizational information is probably the sort of golden key to understanding how corporate culture works. Of course, I would. And it's also highly correlated with other kinds of things. For instance, cooperation, trust. People talk about psychological safety. Well, obvious question is, what is psychological safety correlated with? And I think it's correlated with generative culture. In a generative culture, people are much more likely to feel safe and much more likely to pass on information. And of course, I've got tons of examples, which I'm not going to go into because, you know, we're all familiar with this or that example. But the basic point is that here is something that works. It's highly predictive of an organization's success, and many people find it a very useful way of thinking about, okay, if we're going to have a digital transformation, can we do it using Westrom's ideas? And I'm literally consulting with clients about this at the moment. So I'm very pleased by all this. It's quite lovely.
That's wonderful to know this enriching journey of yours, and thanks for adding a lot of your research work for all of us to follow. Um,
Right.
and coming back to the kind of organizational cultures that you talk about, you mentioned there are three. How do you define a generative culture, Ron, and why is it required according to you in any organization?
Okay, so pathological cultures are easy to identify. They appear in the newspaper a lot. There are people who basically go around talking about how to avoid bad persons in your organization from getting in the way and so forth. So pathological organization is obvious. And bureaucratic organizations, sociology has spent most of its life in the organization field basically talking about bureaucratic organizations. We understand bureaucratic organizations. But I thought, what about the high performers though? What kind of culture are they going to have? Okay. So I started originally by looking at people who are scientifically creative. And I thought scientifically creative people are going to have a different kind of thinking, a generative kind of thinking. So I've been involved in research and development kinds of things basically my whole adult life. And so I thought, okay, so here is something that is going to help us understand research and development. And so what is the generative style of thinking? And the answer is a generative style of thinking is a style of thinking that concentrates on anticipating the future. And so generative organizations tend to be very open. They tend to be very good at information flow. They tend to be highly successful. I would say that something like 80% of top performing organizations are generative. And the ones that aren't generative have special reasons why they were successful. But the interesting thing to me is that Tom Peters, who wrote a famous book called In Search of Excellence, Tom Peters he wrote this book and he didn't see it. He didn't see that there was actually an underlying logic to the organizations that were highly successful. And that logic essentially is a logic of cooperation. If you are on a team where people trust each other, information will flow more quickly. And in fact, if you wanted to say what's a generative organization, I would say an organization where essentially people have such a high level of trust that ideas can zoom back and forth in the organization. And in fact, I even suggested that there was some factor called the IF factor, information flow factor, that could be essentially the secret to corporate success, namely that where IF is high, organizations are able to use the information they've got. Information from within, information from without, information from their own past in many cases. So that's really what generative organizations are like. They tend to be highly creative, and they also tend to be very good at ferreting out problems. When I was working in aviation safety, the biggest thing was how do we avoid having a serious screw up in the air? And so that's an obvious question. How do we do this? Well, so cockpit resource management was an answer, an empirical answer to this very question. And I spent a lot of time talking to people in cockpit resource management. And when it became time for medicine to take this up, I was part of the committee in the American Blood Safety Committee, which reports to our Surgeon General. And we essentially said, okay, we've got these abilities to do this in aviation. Can we do it in medicine too? And so I brought in, along with my colleague Steve Nightingale, who was head of the Blood Safety Committee, I brought in a bunch of people from aviation who would talk about what they had done and specifically cockpit resource management and so forth. And then that was basically turned in favor of medicine. So I can't take credit for the whole development because I wasn't the only person doing this, but I was very pleased that I was able to bring in Bob Helmreich and many other people who were very good at cockpit resource management and describe how this might be applied to, say, surgery and various other kinds of medical procedures.
That's great to know. You have a vast experience in different domains, Ron. I would like you to share your experience about NASA's highly experimental culture and compliance-driven culture of the US Space Shuttle program. Which one is better according to you? Can you please highlight some of your experiences?
Well, so I think the thing that really would make one want to look at this is we had 2 shuttle accidents, which were really, I think, totally avoidable. And the contrast between the Apollo program, which had extraordinarily fine leaders, and the shuttle program I think is really kind of all you need to know. So a good example of this is that Eugene Kranz, who is responsible for, among other things, the saving of Apollo 13, said, there is no excuse for failure. You know, failure is not an option for us. And so he said, well, you know, what kind of organization then do we have to have where failure is not an option? And so in Apollo 13, essentially, something like the whole world got together and tried to help NASA get their astronauts back. And the thing that struck me about it was that Eugene Kranz was not going to lose those astronauts. Whatever it took, he was going to do it to, bring those men home. Well, it's a very different attitude when we get to something like the Columbia Shuttle event, which is being treated essentially initially as sort of business as usual. But it wasn't business as usual. Rodney, whatever his name was, would go back and forth at NASA trying to get people to, for instance, get photos of the spaceship to see if it was damaged. And he was unable to do that. They said, well, there's really no reason for the photos. And they canceled the photos the Air Force had agreed to give him. Okay. Well, when the Columbia exploded, just imagine how the people who had been involved in that must have felt, okay? But there was no excuse for overlooking the ability to get additional information and so forth. And so that's another interesting feature about this, is that the ownership of the problem is a typical thing that goes along with generative organizations. So people take responsibility. They see it as their problem, just as Eugene Kranz saw the astronauts at Apollo 13, his astronauts. You don't find that same level of ownership in the discussions of the mission management group at, the Columbia Shuttle events. It's, they're sort of like, well, this is essentially something routine. Okay, well, when you have people up in space and their lives are at risk, it's not routine. It is never routine. So I think that, you asked about organizational culture. What happened between Apollo and the shuttle? And so I leave that for other people. There are people who've written books about this and so forth. But the basic point is the ownership of the problem had shifted to, it's somebody else's deal. We're just going to do the regular stuff and it'll work out and so forth. And the Apollo program, and the reason the Apollo program had that attitude, and Kranz in particular, is because they had suffered the loss of Apollo 1 on the pad. I mean, when those astronauts burned up, 3 of them died, good men, really good men. That changed something in Mr. Kranz. And I think having had that experience, they weren't going to take any further chances, but somehow, it got routinized. It got bureaucratic. And that's often how it is with high-performing groups. There is another problem, too, with high-performing groups. And that problem is the problem of Cinderella. I don't know if India has this fairy tale Cinderella, or you see this as an American thing and so forth. But this is a very important aspect of this. When you have a high-performance team in an organization, and it outdoes the other teams in that organization, you have a problem of jealousy. And so rather than trying to be that high performance team, everybody tries to figure out how to kill it. And I saw this when I wrote a book about the Sidewinder missile. I commented that China Lake, which had done this, was a real Cinderella for many people, because here was an organization that was making other organizations look bad. So anyway, that's another aspect of this. But ownership of the problem is certainly part of it. And the ability to maintain high performance in the midst of bureaucratic pressures, that's another part of it.
All right, that sounds like a very interesting experience. I was really driven by the stories you have shared about the shuttle programs. Ron, you have also often spoken about culture with requisite imagination, right? Can you please highlight what it is? What do you mean by requisite imagination?
Absolutely. So a good example of this is the Citicorp building in New York. This is well known to architects and so forth. But basically, the building had been put together by some genius architects and consultants. And a student raised a problem with the architectural consultant. His name is Le Mesurier. And he had said basically that, there's no problem with this and just be able to handle all kinds of winds and things like that. Well, this was a 59-story building. And the student said, well, how do you know that this is actually going to be proof against these kinds of wind forces? And he said, well, we did all these calculations originally. And so as long as they built the building according to the way we told them to do it, it'll be just fine. But then he had a second thought. And the second thought was, did they actually follow our instructions exactly? So he called them up and he said, you know, is everything the same as the blueprints and so forth? And they said, absolutely, except we use rivets instead of welds to keep the structural members of this building together. So to make a long story short, it turned out that that was a fatal decision, in that there were winds that New York would get about once every 16 years that would be capable of taking apart a building that was made via rivets instead of welds. So they then fixed all the structural members. They would do it after the secretaries went home at night. They would take off the panels and so on and work on making the structure safe. And meanwhile, of course, watching the weather to make sure that one of these storms wasn't on the way out of the Atlantic to take out the building. And then when they got it all done, they'd say, well, you know, guess what? Your building had this fatal flaw, but we fixed it. All right. So that's a perfect example of what I was talking about, is that the ability to think about, well, what might go wrong, okay? And Le Mesurier had the, I don't know, self-respect or whatever it was to think, well, maybe it isn't as safe as we think. And so there are lots of things like that in life. And obviously engineers all the time are designing things that are going to go wrong. And the better they think about, you know, what could happen, the better the system is likely to be, and the safer it is to put people in or on.
Yeah, absolutely. Ron, where should an enterprise begin with the cultural transformation as per your experiences?
I think the question you asked was, how should they begin the cultural transformation?
Yes.
Aha. So let me point out, first of all, of course, everybody would like to have a generative organization. And the difficulty is that the generative organization is not one thing. It's not a gizmo. So Southwest Airlines, which for many years is my prize example of a generative organization, recently had some very serious problems with their scheduling system. Okay. And so the question is, well, how can this happen? If they're generative, you know, why wouldn't they have thought of this? And the answer is they hadn't paid attention to the faint signals. They had a bunch of previous screw ups. They had been minor, but it was the kind of thing that should have attracted someone's attention. So the difficulty is, of course, if you've got a good organization, the tendency is it's going to be good forever. But the problem was and this is quite common, if you look at generative organizations, how are they likely to screw up if they screw up? And the answer is they won't use a requisite imagination, because most of the time they do the obvious things. They have high morale, you know, they pay their people a lot. They're very loyal to their employees. But the problem is, what about the problem you haven't seen? And so here is an example of requisite imagination being necessary. Is that you have to, first of all, you have to pay attention to the faint signals. But second of all, you have to also be engaged in some kind of mental activity about, you know, how could this go wrong? Maybe the environmental conditions have changed. Nobody's looked at this for a while. Let's take a look and see if this is still safe. And I think this is exactly the kind of thinking that was necessary to get the Citicorp building fixed. And I think this is a very important point. Now, of course, having requisite imagination is important not only for structures and, you know, large, complicated electromechanical systems. It's also important for just about any mission you go on. You know, what could go wrong? And so here is something which is a perfect example of something that if you're going to go into the north, for instance, to the North Pole or the South Pole, you need to think about, okay, so what are the lower temperatures going to do to us? What happens if the compass isn't working, or what happens if the thermometer isn't working. There are literally two expeditions that went to the uh, South Pole, and one of them only had one thermometer, and the other had three. Okay, so here's an example of thinking ahead, trying to build in that extra level of requisite imagination. I think the other example that's very important is thinking about the moon lander, because here was something basically that was going to be landing on the moon. If something went wrong, you couldn't call a repair crew. So they literally had to go through every scenario and say, what are we going to do about this? What are we going to do about this? And so forth. Apollo 13 was made possible in part because of changes made to the lunar lander that allowed it to act as a lifeboat. And this was part of the original design process at Grumman. So when the astronauts got back from Apollo 13, they got on an airplane and they went to Bethpage, Long Island, the Grumman plant basically, and they thanked those people for saving their lives because they had thought about this and they had actually made it possible to use the lunar lander as a lifeboat.
Yeah, that's so amazing to know about so many experiences that you have, Ron, like right from having a generative culture to talk about having a requisite imagination and how can an enterprise start with cultural transformation. I know I can ask you a number of questions around these, considering the kind of experience you possess, but we'll move on to the next round, which is going to be a rapid fire to know you a little better.
Go ahead.
So, Ron, which is your favorite book?
My favorite book?
Yeah.
That's a hard one. Um, I think most of the books that I think are my favorites are the ones by Henry Petroski, who writes about engineering systems. So Invention by Design is probably the one that I like best. But yeah, that's my favorite book. I think Petroski is a brilliant writer, and I think that would be my favorite book.
All right. And I know you read and write a lot. So, what do you do when you're not reading or writing as a hobby?
uh, I study weird things. I study UFOs and things like that because it's a difficult problem, and I'm part of a group now called UFO Med, where we're
Mhm.
going to help people who have had close encounter experiences and so forth. So that's one of my hobbies. I mean, the other hobby is if you look around me, I collect books and old drafting sets. Um, and my children always say, well, there has to be some room for us in the house. You have all these books and things like that. So, but yes.
Yeah, these are some amazing habits. And is do you have any favorite place to travel, like where you can always go when you want to relax and get some quiet time? Is there any favorite place?
Paris. Paris, France is my favorite place. First of all, they have good bookstores
Mhm.
and they have many other entertainments. Um,
Yeah.
my father was a person who was part of the Committee on Data, and he had an office in Paris. And he got the secretary to shift which hotel he stayed in, so it went from one arrondissement to another. So he got to go basically around the whole city and see the thing. So my
Mhm.
father and I both felt Paris was our favorite city, and I like the song where the theme is that Paris is my lover. Well, that's what I feel like.
Oh, that's really wonderful. You have any favorite food?
Popcorn.
Very quick to make.
Right.
Yeah, great. It was fun to know you, dear Ron. I got to know few things which I wasn't aware of about you. So thanks for sharing those. I would now like to have an expert. What is the one thing today's organizational leaders should be very mindful of when it comes to building a generative culture?
Okay. I think the simplest and most direct answer is walk the talk. keep your promises. What is it that builds trust? What builds trust is when you keep your promises. It sounds very simple, but I think that's the underlying undergirding thing of all successful organizations is if you are trusted, then that's a result of the things that you have done. You have kept the promises that you made. Biggest problem is that people think, well, I'm really smart. I really don't have to keep my promises. Well, you do. That's, I think
Thanks,
that's it.
thanks for sharing that tip, walk the talk. And I had such amazing time speaking to you today, learning a lot from you, and really good to speak to you always, Ron. Thanks for joining us.
It is my pleasure.